Good morning. What a great audience with all these bright and young people. It reminds me of the time that it was also bright and young. But anyway, it's a long time ago. The title of my speech is The Evolution of Mass Data Storage. And I start... Oh, I need my... Here. I start with the picture of probably the greatest invention of mankind. Well, yesterday we heard about inventions, but the invention of reading and writing is probably the greatest invention, according to myself, of mankind, because it allows us to stand on the shoulders of our predecessors. We don't have to learn everything by experience. We just can read a book about, for example, how to kill an animal or how to kill a cat. We can learn from a book. And this is how it started, actually, with hieroglyphs. Well, maybe there are also, I'm not sure. I was educated in the West, so maybe there are also scriptures in China or in other countries, but this is what I, from Wikipedia, know is probably the first example of reading and writing and reading. I don't know whether there is an egg or chicken problem in reading and writing, whether you first write and then read or the other way around. But anyway, this is reading and writing. The invention is at least 4,000 or 5,000 years old, and it was a very awkward invention, nasty invention. It was a terrible invention, actually, for the first time. It took hours, days, before you could write a simple message. For example, a simple message to your wife, "I will be late, dear." Writing that message could probably take half a day or maybe a day, and probably your wife or your husband couldn't even read it, but that's a wrong story. We were talking about data storage, and in data storage, the numbers of bits that you can store per square millimeter or meter, whatever, is an important parameter. So there are around 1,000 hieroglyphs, and I estimated that the aerial information density is around a tenth of a bit per square millimeter, because the hieroglyphs are around, square inch. This was the very start of data storage, because this is clearly data storage. And this is how it went on after some time. This is I love this picture very much, because you show here a big library of the Pope, I believe, and it shows, essentially it shows all the knowledge of the world of that time, written in books. And all those books in those days were written by hand. They were hand copied. Book printing actually was invented much, much later. And I love it. There were around 2,000 volumes, and let's say that each volume was around a gigabyte something. So then we have here 2 terabytes of information. And this whole knowledge in those days was just 2 terabytes. Okay. Much later than the invention of reading and writing, mankind made another invention, and that was the invention of book printing. Book printing was a very essential step in the democratizing the knowledge, because up till now, up till the invention of book printing, knowledge was just restricted to a very small part of the world. Maybe a small percentage of the upper class could read and write and could also afford themselves books. But after the invention of book printing, also ordinary people could afford to buy books and to read books and to acquire knowledge, which was, I think, therefore, one of the greatest inventions of mankind. Then something changed. Something changed, because up till 1950, up to the war or so, there were no computers. Well, there were human computers, calculators, but the invention of computing machinery just after the war, Second World War, was also a great invention for mankind. And in order to use electronic computers, we also need data storage for the data themselves, but also for to run the programs and so on. This machine here, I love it. I really love this machine. I wished I could have been a member of the design group that made this first data storage, the first Winchester disk drive in the world. This was designed and sold by IBM in 1956. This is the very first hard disk drive in the world. It could, so they had around how many platters, so disks, I believe I have it, 50 disks of 24 inches, 60 centimeters. And that's enormous thing. And if you see the thing, it's like a big machine, really big, and it contained only 5 million characters of 6 bits. In those days, they didn't have bytes, but they had 6 bits for some reason. I don't know why, but anyway. And the areal density was 1 bit per square millimeter. So you could actually see, without a microscope, you could see the bits actually. If you have magnetic eyes, you could see the bits. But anyway, it's a marvelous machine. And just to tell a few things about the history of IBM. IBM was selling computers, as we say, but essentially the system was, for IBM, was what we called a razor blade system. So you sell your computer at low cost, but what you're really selling is hard disk drives. That's what IBM has been doing for at least 50 years. The computer was low cost, but this disk drive cost at least $1 million, okay? And a megabyte is just for insurance companies and so on. It's just no information, actually. So they have to buy at least 100 or 200 of these disk drives, and that's where the real cost for your computers is. What happened thereafter? Yes, this is a smaller invention. When I was a young engineer, I started at Philips Research Laboratory to start on optical disc recording. And that's an official name for probably things that you know as compact discs, DVDs, and Blu-ray. There we use, instead of magnetic material, we have an optical material with small pits, shallow pits that can be read by a laser using interferograms. And the information is actually stored in this disk, can easily be replicated, of course, a very low cost replication. So this in the 80s, the CD-ROMs were compared with the invention of the book printing, because the information could be replicated very quickly and at a very low cost. And in the 80s up till 2000 around, so till up to 20 years ago, this was essentially the only way to disseminate information, digital information, at low cost. Because the CD discs or the CD-ROM disc cost maybe only 1 cent. And extremely useful for example, for disseminating the Windows operating system, or encyclopedia, and so on and so on. All the encyclopedias, all the information was in those days on optical disc, because the magnetic disc in those days was expensive and also had a low density and low capacity. When CD-ROM was introduced, it had a capacity of around ½ gigabyte, which in those days was huge, was absolutely huge, because the hard disk drive could only, and the floppy disk drives only had a capacity of 1 megabyte, which is a factor of 500 lower than the capacity of this low-cost CD-ROMs. What happened thereafter? Sure, this is what you probably know. This is the hard disk drives. It started in 1950 with this huge thing, and this is much smaller. The thing that you can find in your desktop computer is much smaller. It's around a few centimeters wide and a few centimeters long. And it contains, nowadays, if you go to the Simlink building and you buy a hard disk drive, it probably has currently around 10 terabytes, which is a huge amount of of storage. The aero density is 1 gigabit per square millimeter. Compare that with the very first hard disk drive that had only 1 bit per square millimeter. Nowadays, after 70 years, we're talking about 1 gigabit per square millimeter, which is an enormous step in density. And the reliability is high. You don't hear too often of disk crashes and so on. And there is, because again, if you go to a shop for buying a computer, a laptop, for example, it starts to be difficult to buy a laptop computer with a hard disk drive because they have been surpassed by solid-state drives. What is a solid-state drive? That's essentially a piece of silicon, of semiconductor, that replaces that can store large amount of information, and also you can easily random access the information, and you can also change it very easily and very rapidly. So the hard disk drives now are under the way of being diminished, I think. Also because the expenses that you need to go to the next generation of hard disk drive has to be paid by the consumers who buy hard disk drives. But if you lose, let's say, 50% of your market, then also the investments to be made in the new generation of hard disk drive is hard to guarantee. And solid states will make probably for the future will probably be the next and the ultimate generation of mass data storage. Where are we talking about? They are compatible with hard disk drives. You can easily change in the older computers. You could easily change replace the hard disk drives by the solid-state drives. They're very fast. Very fast. You don't have to wait because the hard disk drive, they are rotating disks. You don't have to wait till your information finally, in a few milliseconds or microseconds, finally passes your head and can be read. Nowadays, they are slightly more expensive than hard disk drives. Only slightly, maybe. Depends on how you look at it. Maybe a factor of 10 if you compare it on a byte basis. But most people are much satisfied with, let's say, a terabyte or half a terabyte, and then maybe the difference in price is maybe $50 or $100 or so. Well, nobody cares about anyway. It's just how you compute it. Per byte, it's maybe a factor of 10 or 100. For useful, it's only $50 or $100. The power consumption is important, maybe not for you, but for people who have big servers, the cloud, so to speak. Then they are consuming a normal cloud will probably consume 200 megawatt. So if you can just reduce it by a factor of 20% or 30%, that's a huge step because that's a lot of information. That's a lot of electrical energy. Capacity, the normal capacity that you buy now in the shops is 1 terabyte or so. For let's say $150 or so, you probably can buy now. This thing. The future of solid-state drives is great, absolutely great, because, we do not yet see or foresee that the Moore's law will diminish. So we still see the new products coming from Veldhoven, made by ASML, who produce all the machines that produce silicon, is still going up to higher density. Now even we are talking about density of 5 or 6 nanometers per whatever, and so the dimensions and the cost price of solid-state drives will go up. And, this is important because the amount of storage that we require apparently in our society grows and grows and grows and grows. If you look at the internet capacity of the internet itself, so the whole internet that you can access from your phone or from whatsoever, is around 10 to the power 20 bytes. Okay, keep that in mind. 10 to the 20, 10 to the 21, something like that. Probably there is some acronym for it, but I don't know it. And essentially it is almost doubling every year because everyone puts his photos in his movies and whatever up to the internet, and somewhere it has to be stored in a cloud or in your personal computer or whatsoever. So there is a growing interest in more capacity, but fortunately solid state drive, to my best knowledge, will actually fill that role. It's no problem. Well, maybe after 10 years, but anyway, we will see that in 10 years. What will happen now for the future? Because this was all essentially the past. So these are the data centers. So this is a picture of a data center. Normally nobody is allowed to enter such data centers, and I don't know why they have lights actually, maybe only for the picture. Probably they switch off the light during operation of the machines. And I learned that in Japan. When I first came in Japan, I saw factories and there were no lights in the factory. No lights in the factory. Because everything was done by robots. And they said, why is there light? So there's only light when there is some malfunctioning of the machine. Then we have to put on the light. So if there is light, something is wrong. But otherwise, everything is dark. They were very proud that the factories were dark, no light. And the same applies to clouds. And essentially, we are using it. Now, we are coming to an interesting point because, well, we are now looking into the future, and up to now, I think everybody is quite satisfied with the data storage that we have available, at the price that you can buy it, and so on and so on. But engineers like myself, but also scientists like you, have been thinking of alternative ways of storing data, not in optical mechanisms or in magnetic data systems or in stone, like we started, but anyway, no, we could store it in biological material called DNA. DNA is, well, I am not a biologist, I'm an electrical engineer, but DNA is a molecule that carries the genetic instructions used in the growth, functioning and reproduction of known living organisms. That's how you know DNA. And DNA, if you read about DNA in the newspapers, it probably has to do with the finding criminals who left some DNA on the body of a girl or another person. And that's usually the way you learn about DNA when you read in the newspaper. So DNA for storing information is a miraculous thing, maybe. And we know from the newspapers too that DNA is extremely durable because, well, some old animals are found in Siberia, usually in Siberia, and they were at least 100,000 years old, and even in movies they are actually revived. All that DNA, you can find it, and you can actually find the dinosaurs in the movies that actually were revived by mad scientists, but anyway, that's how it is. But it's durable, which is fantastic. If you want to store your information, you probably also want to read it after many years without any errors and so on. And DNA-based storage is another thing. And this is one of the new generations or findings for data storage. And it was also remarked yesterday by Ben Feringa that Feynman said in the 50s that there is a lot of space at the bottom, okay, and the molecule basis. And this is essentially working on the molecule basis. And it has been known that DNA can be made and can be read, or the information in the. But the very first experiment using DNA for storage is only 8 years old, as you can see. The very first experiments were made by a church and his co-workers, and it has been published in Science. And they showed with their very first experiments, so they actually made DNA, they synthesized DNA, and after a few days or whatsoever, they synthesized the DNA and could refind and could retrieve the information that was stored in that information. So essentially what they did is send a file of information, a movie actually, to the factory where they produce the molecules of DNA, very small molecules, and that can be read with sufficient accuracy. They also had error correcting system, modulation system, encoding, and so on. Their findings can be read here. It says that a kilogram, let's say a pint of beer, okay, a pint of beer is sufficient to store the whole internet. That's essentially their finding. True. A pot of coffee, something like that, can store the whole internet of DNA. This is huge. We're talking business, so to say. Writing and reading, unfortunately, is very slow. If you go to a factory and it takes days to synthesize the DNA. Just as awkward as the very first invention of hieroglyphs. That also took days before you had a small message. So, not to take too much attention to it. Probably it will speed up if there is enough and sufficient interest in to commercialize it, then the speed goes up. And also because also you saw that the speed of sequencing, so that's the reading of the information, also went down very, very quickly. It started with days that you needed to sequence the DNA of a human or of animals, but now that you can do it in seconds. So as long as there is commercial interest, prices go down. And I just read the price, okay? I said in a newspaper interview that that it's extremely expensive. If you want to store a file, let's say a DVD film or something, so that will be a few, half gigabyte or a gigabyte of information in DNA, will probably cost you $5 million US. Well, okay, that's very expensive, and particularly expensive for laboratories who like to do experiments in that field. But anyway, it can be done, and that's fine. Random access is a difficult issue here, very difficult, because, well, look at the information. Well, let us start again. In the hard disk drives, we know, I know, or all the designers of the hard drive know where the information is. You store it between specific sectors or specific information, and once you place it there, it will never go away. It will always be there, will not be replaced by somebody. But if you have your pint of beer with all the DNA, and you mix it and you shake it a little bit, then the information of your film that was first at the top will probably at the bottom, okay? So you just don't know where your information is. It's gone. So that means that if you want to find your film, you have to sequence the whole pot of beer before you can find your film. Oh, this is not very handy. And also when you sequence the information, you also destroy the original information, and you have to remake it again. But anyway, that's the state of the art of the DNA-based storage, but I think it will improve in the long end. I'm sure it will, just keep in mind the hieroglyphs 5,000 years ago, how awkward it was. This is also now very awkward, I think, but anyway. Destructive readout. So let's just have a survey of well, let's compare some properties of the hard disk drive and the flash memory and the bacterial DNA. And then, for example, you see for reading and writing that well, you can compare it yourself, and quite remarkable is, I can use this one. Quite remarkable is the very high density of the DNA-based storage. But keep in mind that now something has changed. We are not computing the number of bits per square millimeter that I have done during the whole speech, but somebody put a 3 here instead of a 2, because that's very tricky, actually. That's very tricky and very smart too. Because people like myself who have been around and have been working on hard disk drives and an optical disk, they all compute the number of bits per square millimeter. But now the people who are working, like myself, I'm working on DNA, they say, no, we compute it per volume, because then we have a factor of 1,000,000 more. Essentially, if you do the computation, you will see that the size of the molecule is approximately, the length and the width is approximately the same as the size of a bit in a hard disk drive. around 50 nanometers. Okay, but the thickness is also of this molecule is also around 50 nanometers, while the hard disk drive, the size of a hard disk drive or of a compact disk is 1 millimeter. So you gain the thickness of the disk essentially by saying this is 2 to the power 19 instead of 2 to the power 13, and it's all to do with the volume density and not with the areal density. The power usage, for example, watts per gigabyte when you store it is, well, is essentially, well, very close to 0 for hard disk drive and also very close to 0 for flash memory. So, well, of course, when you compare, again, about the data density, because that's really interesting, I think this really intrigues me, because this is the most important parameter when you compare DNA-based storage versus the ancient data storage, is the data density. For example, if you take a hard disk drive and you remove all the electronics, all the hardware, everything, and only keep the disks, okay, you make the disk a little bit thinner, then maybe you also, well, can improve the volume density maybe by a factor of 50 or so. So then this difference becomes less. But anyway, because, well, of course, if you remove the electronics, then you can restore it later, and maybe that takes a few minutes for a robot to put it down. But if you really store it for later, much later, then this is fine. So what is the, well, how does it really work? You have, let me see, you have the binary information, so the film or the movies or whatever, pictures. You do some encoding, which is being done by people like myself and by my colleagues here in Singapore or elsewhere, because there are many, let's say, constraints that that you have on these DNA strands. For example, it is not very wise to have the same DNA molecule, let's say more than 4 or 5 of the same molecule after each other, because then the reliability of that synthesized DNA is close to 0. And so you need coding steps to remove that. Also, there should be some balance between CT and AT and so on. But anyway, these are details that people like myself can easily solve. Then you go to a factory here, for example, in Singapore or in the United States or elsewhere, and you ask to, with this file that you send them, you ask them to do synthesizing. Then everything will be put in a container. It's a drop, essentially a drop of fluid for standard information that you can pay, that you can afford. Then you go to a standard DNA sequencer that you can just buy at low cost, and you retrieve the information again. So this is the essence of the whole thing. It's a little bit slow and expensive at the moment. This is, I think, my final thing, and here you can see the comparison between this is taken from the paper by Church in 2012, and what we see on the horizontal axis is the log 10 of the bits encoded in production or in the demo. So, and here we again keep in mind, always keep in mind that this is a volume density, okay, not the area density. And then the CD and DVD, it hurts me, of course, to see these equipment, this low rank. But anyway, this is how it is, because they are thick, okay? And CDs has the thickness of 1.2 millimeters, and probably one of the reasons why Blu-ray is much higher is that the thickness is only half, 0.6 millimeters. Anyway, that's, but when we created the DVD and the Blu-ray, we never thought about volume density. Nobody cared, actually. And also volume density of the flash and the magnetic tape is, well, it really hurts. The magnetic tape is better than optical recording. That really hurts. But anyway, according to this. Then there are things that I really cannot place, but maybe somebody else will explain me that later during the break, what the 12 atom memory is, and also what XC positioning is, or quantum holography. I know about holography, that's an optical method, but anyway, quantum holography is also very interesting. But anyway, this work, so Church's work on DNA-based storage is here with 10 to the power 16 bits, yes, bits per volume unit, is above all other possibilities. So this is a very promising technology, and it's great. I'm not sure there is another diagram. No, this is it. So I have seen now 10 minutes for questions. I'm not sure I'm allowed to answer questions, but I love to have questions, and maybe there are questions, and maybe there is another microphone or other ways. Okay.
Okay, so are there any questions? We'll just take one or two. Yeah, lady, you wanna, there's a mic here.
Oh, there are microphones in this room. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. Yeah, I think I can also talk loud. So with respect to the DNA approach, so I like it a lot, but so in my so I think actually DNA has random access information, or like so quick random access, right? So it's just like we try to convert DNA into our computer-based system. But so if I take the human body, I have all these like identifier sequences on my DNA, which allow me to have like protein binding sites, and my protein can bind to the DNA. So I think actually like, so it's just we try to convert DNA, or like we try to put DNA in our like kind of bitwise system, rather than like keeping it in its like system nature created, which like create the difficulties we face now, like using it as a storage. So like, to keep it short, so why we have like these like SSDs and hard drives which work for our bitwise computer system, there we can like kind of like use all the benefits, like so like everything we need. We designed these like storage spaces for it, and DNA doesn't come with it, but DNA comes with like an entire biological machinery which we so far don't like exploit, right? So I think it is even more beneficial if we also like kind of like exploit the entire machinery which comes with this into our computer-based system, into our computers. So this was just more a comment than a question.
That's more a remark, I think, than a question, is it? But anyway, no, I love your remark, because it also reminds me that I forgot to explain things. For example, the DNA in a human being or in animals is not, well, it's not the DNA that I'm talking about, because the DNA materials here only has around 100 or 200 nucleotides, while, so that is the elementary molecule. In a human being or in animals or whatever, it goes up to billions. So that's impossible to make. So we make very small molecules of only 200 NT, and that's it. And that makes life for coding people like myself very difficult, because, as I said, normally we know where all the information is on a hard disk drive, on a solid state drive, and you know where it is. So you do error correction, and you do because you miss information, or you have errors and you have erasures, and you don't know what the information is. But here in DNA, the task is much challenging, because you just don't know where the information is. You have all these small molecules. See it as a book without an index, okay? No index. And also the pages are not numbered, okay? And we throw all the pages around. That's what you do with DNA-based storage. You just don't know where all the information is, and you even don't know, you only know that the information should be somewhere. But anyway, and it could also be an error. My goodness, this is for information theorists like myself, this is a really interesting challenge. That's why I love to work on this area, because, well, you just don't know where your information is. You don't know whether it's an error or not, or whether the information is really, well, if you take the DNA from the container, probably 5 or 10% of the DNA will remain in that container, because you cannot remove it, essentially. So you say, my goodness, how can I ever restore the information that was put there 100 years ago? Anyway, who cares what is happening in 100 years. But anyway, but you must guarantee that the information can be restored. Thank you for your remark. Thank you. If there are more remarks or questions, or if you like to have the question in the break, you're also more welcome. And then we go to our...
Yeah. So any more questions? Just one more. If not, we can keep it to the break and you can interact with Professor Immink. Okay, just one more. About the lady over there. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for the
Hello.
talk.
Good morning.
So you are talking here about the problems of DNA that you don't have the index, but we are able to immobilize the DNA to a surface, right? So why cannot we just immobilize the DNA molecules, those short DNA molecules you are talking about, to a surface and get the index in this way, have the random access?
Well, you just don't know where the molecules are. They are just floating in a fluid, and there is, well, maybe new inventions have to be made so that they are stuck somewhere, so that they cannot float around. But anyway, that's true.
Well, but we are able to like really immobilize the DNA molecules to a surface so that they are not floating around, right?
That would be great. That would be great. But anyway, I'm not aware of that.
Well, so if you know how Illumina sequencing works, they are immobilizing the DNA molecules to a surface of like a tiny cell. So they are not exactly, like you say, moving around in the liquid. So
I really don't know your answer to the question. And also, if you have to immobilize it and put it somewhere on a substrate or something, then probably the volume density is decreasing again, because then you need at least a substrate of a certain density or whatever. So if you put it on, maybe you can put it on a disk, just like the thickness of a hard disk drive. But then,
well, so it's like you just put it to the disk with one end, and it's the length of the DNA is still floating. Just
I see. Okay.
One end, so you still have kind of volume there, I guess.
Okay, it would be great. It could be great. We talk about it later during the break.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you. Thank you for your information.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Immink.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you.